I'm not sure that I collect books anymore. There was a time when I'd have said that I collected anything by Arthur Machen and Sylvia Townsend Warner. When I hear the word collect, I'm always reminded of how I used to glue PG Tips tea cards into an album when I was small, with the hope of completing the full set. Book collecting can get a little like that if you're not careful. With Arthur Machen and Sylvia Townsend Warner, I did want to have everything that they'd ever published, and I pretty much succeeded, with just a few exceptions. Some of the fun went out of it when the internet came along. I could go to my computer right now and order those last few items to finalise the set, as long as I'm willing to stump up the cash. I now look out for books purely to read, and if I like them enough, I'll keep them. They'll go onto my shelves, and I won't want to part with them. I don't want to acquire books simply for the sake of collecting anymore. There is the perennial problem of space. I've never had to have first editions, although they do have their charm. With some books, the later edition is in fact the better edition, as with Harry Clarke's volume of Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination. Some of my favourite books were only ever published as a first edition. They were never reprinted. The author's signature enhances a book, and I like association copies, but the most important association for me these days is the time and place in which I acquired and read a book. The most important of the few copies I have of books signed by the author are those that are inscribed to me personally. The first books I ever owned would have been presents from my family. I still have a few of my first books which were handed down to my younger sisters and which have come back to me, like The Model Railwaymen Take Over. One of the earliest books I remember being really intrigued by was The Robber Hotston Plots. But the first books I remember buying with my own money, or with money given to me for that purpose, were through the Scholastic Book Services. There would be a printed brochure that we could take home from school, and I remember poring over it and ordering a book by Roger Price and Julian Gregory about the Tomorrow People. I'd seen the series on the TV, which I loved, and I assumed that once aired, the episodes would be gone forever. But as books, here were those stories, permanently. And so I kept the books I had read. I wasn't collecting them, just keeping them. Anything that I read and liked. I borrowed some great books from the library, but I can't remember any of them now, because I've not been able to regularly reacquaint myself with them over the years. The first time that I ever thought about collecting books was when I started to read Enid Blyton's mystery series, and then later I discovered the James Bond books. These are my original copies, and there have been times when I could have upgraded them to first editions, and for financial reasons I really should have done. They'd be worth a fortune now. But these are the first editions that I actually owned. And then I discovered the Penguin Modern Classics. Suddenly a whole weird and wonderful world opened up before me. I would have been about 13. I came across a copy of Colin Wilson's The Outsider, which I used as a guidebook. A light green Penguin Modern Classic spine. In fact, any Penguin paperback would always stand out and would be worth trying to read. I became a literary snob, and unbelievably pretentious, but it wasn't the philosophical ideas that I loved as much as the access to strange cultures and characters. And then I discovered Arthur Machen. I was looking for existentialist literature in the second-hand bookshops of Brighton, and the wonderful Mr. Brooks on Queen's Road gave me a copy of The Hill of Dreams, this exact copy. I assumed that Machen was another existentialist. Then I came across his horror stories, and I was completely confused. For the first time I decided that I wanted to know more about a writer, if I was to understand their writing. And I had to do some detective work. I picked up items here and there, which just served to add to the intrigue. I stopped being a passive reader and a casual accumulator of books, and I became a proper collector. It was through the Arthur Machen connection that I came across the writings of Sylvia Townsend Warner, a wonderfully versatile and witty writer, and one with a great social conscience. Whereas with Machen there was the Goldston and Sweetser bibliography to guide my collecting, with Sylvia Townsend Warner there wasn't a bibliography. I had to create my own. This meant that my collecting moved onto another level. Later, I became fascinated by Edward Heron-Allen, who wrote strange fiction under the pseudonym of Christopher Blair. At first, nobody seemed to know anything about Christopher Blair or Heron-Allen. I wrote a few articles about him and co-founded a society to help promote understanding of him and his work. But unfortunately, too much information came to light. The author had so many interests that people from all kinds of backgrounds came out of the woodwork from all over the world. Very soon, too much information was available. For a collector of books, one of the problems is unearthing ephemeral material, pamphlets and booklets, which don't sit easily on the shelf. And then there are all those contributions made by the author to other books. And there's not a lot you can do when you discover that there's unpublished material, apart from setting yourself up as a publisher, which I did, as the Tartarus Press. Our first hardback book was the unpublished chapters 5 and 6 to Arthur Machen's The Secret Glory. And then we collected his fugitive fiction in Ritual and Other Stories. The first proper Tartarus Press books were styled on some of the special editions published in the 1920s. Specifically, we looked at the style and design of books like Machen's large paper, limited edition The Shining Pyramid. Even today we're refining the design. The books are printed lithographically on the nicest paper we can find. We rarely laminate our jackets, although it does make them liable to damage. Lamination makes them too shiny and modern looking. Ideally, we'd like them all to look like they were published in the 1920s. And we don't just reprint Machen and other writers from the past. We've always published contemporary fiction, and hopefully, 100 years after these books are published, people may discover them and appreciate what we've done as Tartarus Press, in the same way that I discovered the work of writers like Arthur Machen, Sylvia Townsend Warner, and Edward Heron-Allen.